والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا Muhammad وآله وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. We have been looking at the relationship between secularism and modernism. The relationship between secularism and modernism. The relationship between secularism and modernism. And last time we had some useful discussion. And basically, what I understood or took away from that discussion was that secularism has many forms. Firstly, secularism is a form of this worldliness. And this worldliness can take many forms as well. And modernism, on the other hand, is, we didn't talk much about modernism, but modernism is a specific ideology which focuses on the divinity of human beings. So the essence of modernism is humanism, which can take different forms as well: individualism, socialism, nationalism, etc. So from this we can make some general claims, for example, as to the relationship between secularism and modernism. So generally we can say that you can be secular without being modernist. So probably we can claim that the ancient Greek culture was secular in the sense which we defined as a culture focusing on this world, to certain in various ways in which ancient Greek culture was secular, but certainly not modernist, because general dominant view, even though you can find forms of humanism in ancient Greek culture, you can't say that they were humanist. Their view is more a form of because in a humanist culture, main value, as we know, is freedom and human will. On the other hand, in the dominant ideas in at least the philosophical culture of ancient Greece is more like justice and balance. So, for example, pagan cultures, they might or might not be secular, but they are for sure not modernists. I'm talking about ancient and medieval pagan culture, not pagan cultures today, which has been modernized and become modernist. They were not modern because they didn't believe in divinity of human beings in our own modern specific sense. They were more naturalist, cosmologist, or something like that. In fact, in order for modernism to become possible, it was important to marry Christianity and Greek philosophies and paganism. So they provide a sort of necessary condition for the emergence of modernism. So what I'm saying is that you can be secular without being modernist. That's another question, whether today we can be secular without modernism, without being modernist. Probably harder, because modernism is so dominant. In fact, I think that today secularism actually comes into and affect people more through modernism rather than the other way. So people who are not even secular, because they are impressed by modernism, they become secular in a sense. And we'll look at some of the examples in a minute. So to answer the specific question heads on, the question, how can we distinguish between or are modernist from a secularist? I would say if a person or a movement is this worldly movement, that is, believe in some sort of this worldliness in ideology or practice, because it's possible that this worldliness come through within or grips many ideologies which are actually in their claim otherworldly ideologies, but practices, through certain practices or lack thereof, this worldliness become hegemonic in those movements. So it's not just ideology, practice is very important as well. So we can distinguish between a modernist and a secularist by saying that if a person or an ideology is this worldly, that their all focus or most of their focus or dominant focus is on this world in one way or another, we are not specifying in which way, but they don't believe in or the idea of humanism is humanism, or the idea of freedom of or mastery of human will is not dominant, um, then they are not modernists according to our definition, but they are secularists. And on the other hand, if you believe in modernism, then I think you are necessarily secularist as well, unless you can think of some weird way in which you um, I'm sure it's theoretically possible, but today it's very hard to find a modernist who is not a secularist. Okay. Now, what we said about this relationship between secularism and modernism becomes a bit more complicated if we introduce into this equation, which we must, the idea of capitalism, because humanism in its modernist form is closely related to capitalism. And that's how it is. Humanism is a belief in the divinity of human beings. It can take the form of individualism, communitarianism, or speciesism. But you can't establish the divinity of human beings and their absolute mastery unless you overcome scarcity. And scarcity is the thing which limits human divinity, the mastery, human freedom, and human desire to do what they want or to will what they will. And capitalism is the way which modern humanism think we will overcome scarcity. So what modern humanism has done has basically delivered itself to capitalism. So when we say modernism today, it means capitalism. When we say humanism today, what we mean is capitalism, whether that capitalism is individualistic or communitarian or specie-bound capitalism. So what we need to do is to go back to our equation and ask our question again, but this time by introducing this third element, which is capitalism. So can somebody be a secular today and not a modernist and not a capitalist? Yes, possible. It's possible. But it's not possible that you are a modernist and not secular, and that become clear because capitalism is a form of, in fact, the most dominant, the most consistent form of this worldliness the world has ever seen. Because what you dedicate yourself is to multiplying things, accumulating for the sake of accumulation, so you are able to eternalize yourself in this universe as well. So not any real adjustment has to be made by the introduction of capitalism, but what happens is the secular nature of modernism and humanism, or at least modern humanism, become clear when we establish this link between modernism, humanism, and capitalism. Okay. So I think it's enough for this question. So let's move to the second question, which is what's the difference between a Muslim secularist and a Muslim modernist? Or how we can differentiate between Muslim secularists and Muslim modernists, and whether every Muslim secularist is necessarily Muslim modernist, or every Muslim modernist is a Muslim secularist, etc. Now, the first thing is we have to always distinguish between Muslim and Islamic, because Muslim just means a person who is born in Muslim family and has a Muslim, is culturally Muslim or something like that, but his or her ideologies don't flow from Islam as such. So I don't think we need to worry about those people. Uh, so, but then there are people whose ideology partially flows from Islam, and there are third type of people whose ideology basically fully flow from Islam. So there are three types of people. So there are people who are just nominally Muslims. So their ideologies, whether they are secular or modernist or whether both, sorry, their ideology doesn't flow from Islam. Like they don't even claim at all. And then the second group were Muslim who have not totally abandoned Islam, for example, tactically or theoretically. We don't need to go into that. So their ideology partially flows from Islam. So, for example, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, for example, would be some such person, because he justifies a lot of his stuff with reference to the Quran and thing. Number three is the Islamic, whose ideology flows from or claim to flow from Islam, full-fledged. So these are three different types. And we can find secular and modernist or both in all three groups. And the way secularism or modernism get into these groups and its dynamic would be different. And this is the whole topic of study and research, I think. Now, generally speaking, a Muslim secular is someone who is, or whose ideology or practice is this worldly, in one of the ways we looked in this session and the previous session. And Muslim modernist is somebody who is humanist and capitalist. Now, whether he or she justifies this with reference to Islam or not, that's another person. Islam or not, that's another question. So conceptually speaking, it's possible that someone is secular but not modern, for example. So, for example, I would say, for example, like early Wahhabi movement, for example, or Saudi movement was a secular movement in some sense, but you can't say they were modernist. They were not humanists, although humanism might have, yeah. I don't think, neither they were capitalists at least at the start, but that's secularism, because of the dominance of humanism, and capitalism became capitalist humanists as the thing went on. So you have this Muslim movement to establish a Saudi regime in 19th century and early 20th century, which is a secular movement, but probably it's not a modernist movement. But today it's probably very hard to find people who are not who are secular but not modernist. And my hunch is that today secularism actually penetrates into Muslim movements and Muslim thought more through modernism than the other way around. Okay, except for probably in Muslim in countries where Muslims are large minorities, then secularism become a practical issue for them. Apart from modernism, for example, in India, so there might be some exceptions there. Okay. Now, we would have to actually do at least one more session on this, but I will finish with this rather startling claim here. One way today, or at least in early 20th century, secularism creeps into Islamic and even non-Islamic, for example, Christian movements, Islamic movements, Islamic uh, schools of thought is through actually excessive otherworldliness. This is strange. We talked about it last time how in Augustinian thinking, for example, secularism was provided the foundation through a overblown version of or overblown or excessive otherworldliness or a specific form of otherworldliness which denigrates the world as such. And in Islamic groups, some Islamic groups, for example, in the subcontinent, for example, Orthodox Islamic groups, and you will find this for Orthodox Islamic groups, for example, you will find this in the thought of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi and his followers. He's one uh, a great scholar and a grand scholar and Sufi and Hakim and Mujaddid. But despite that, an Orthodox Muslim scholar, absolutely Orthodox. But in his thought, there's, and I think this thought came through the dominance of colonialism as well. There's some notion that the world, for example, politics, are unclean or not worthy of our attention if our attention has to be focused on the other world or something like that. You'll find this thought in Maulana Zakaria's critique of Maulana Maududi as well. And you'll also find similar thought in the followers of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi, for example, Usmani groups. And in here, a certain notion of otherworldliness. And this notion is that this world is so bad that it doesn't deserve the attention of a believer. And this argument was developed either to divert the attention of Muslim scholars and religious students from politics, but also specifically from revolutionary politics, because Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi did, and his followers did support the mainstream politics, for example, that of Muslim League, and before that, that of the English colonialist or the imperialists. But this notion of otherworldliness, which thinks that this world is beneath the attention of a believer, actually practically brings in the dominance of a version of secularism, where you don't pay any attention to certain very influential part of social activities, or at least you don't pay attention enough, or don't pay attention as you in a way you should have, like you don't engage in a revolutionary activity or struggle, for example. And this has been one way in which secularism creeped into orthodox thought in a subcontinent, for example. And once you have secularism, it's very easy to and inevitable to slide into modernism, humanism, and capitalism, as is seconded by, for example, the activities of the Osmani group, the followers of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi in Pakistan, for example. And this was the way, and this is very similar to how Luther justified secularism. He basically said the world is so bad and so we should let these devils play their game in this world, and we only need to focus on the hereafter. And hereafter for him was this strange conception. It has nothing to do with outside of yourself. This is strange conception between self's relationship between the Holy Spirit or the God directly. And that's how secularism creeped. This was the Protestant justification for secularism, and was very influential in for secularism to get foothold in, well, modern secularism to get foothold in the Western thinking and practice in early modern period. Okay, another way secularism creeps into Muslim Islamic into Islamic thought is through practice. For example, not just practice, but for example, in Wahhabi movement, for example, and Salafi movement in general, I mean, they developed, I think, justified critique of the Islamic discipline of tasawwuf and the practice of tasawwuf. But that critique was negative in the sense that they didn't put anything in place of that. So they didn't put a reformed theory and study and practice of tasawwuf, for example. You can name whatever name you want to do. You can call it ihsan, except for general theoretical tracts which don't do the work of which the discipline of tasawwuf and actually practice and the institutionalization of tasawwuf did in Islamic history and civilization. So what happens is that you develop a critique of a discipline which was specifically focused on overcoming this worldliness and inculcating um, otherworldliness through a discourse as well as through practice and institutionalization. So you through your critique you have destroyed that, but you haven't put anything in its place. So you have this empty space which is filled by what is natural for people to follow their desires, and just practicing the zahir, or the external obligations, which are obviously absolutely important, but they are not sufficient to sustain the otherworldliness living in this world. So what happened is that this worldliness become part and parcel of such societies and movements, and they become very this worldly, even though they are religious and even though theoretically they don't believe in this worldliness. This is a strange phenomena, which we see in Wahhabi movement and Salafi movements around the world, and any Islamic movement or thought which has denied the discipline of the soul and has done away with this discourse and practices and institutions. This happens to it. For example, Jamaat Islami, for example, as in Mullah Maududi's thought, secularism comes through this window as well. Okay, and I think the last, now I'll finish at this, and we'll pick up these threads in the next session. Is that the third window through which secularism creep into Islamic movements is through not understanding modernism as humanism and the nature of humanism and its relationship to capitalism. And because of this, even those who reject modernism, like Maulana Maududi, for example, reject humanism, reject capitalism, and many other Islamic movements and orthodox scholars, because of their faulty understanding of modernism, humanism, and capitalism, they are, and since they are dealing with it, they end up justifying on Islamic ground certain institution practices and theories of modernism, humanism, and capitalism. And I think then modernism come into those movements, and with modernism, secularism into those movements through this window. And I think in our subcontinent this has happened to Jamaat Islami, and this has also happened to the scholars in group of ulama who have tried to deal with certain aspects of modernism. For example, in the thought of Maulana Taqi Usmani, for example, we call these people revisionist. Maulana Maududi is not revisionist, but secularism come into his theory as well through not understanding capitalism and modernism and humanism well enough. And even though there's no justification for capitalism as such in Maulana Maududi's thought, we find such justification in Maulana Taqi Usmani's thought. But in Maulana Maududi's thought, we find the justification of democracy and human rights and constitutionalism. And through those windows, secularism and modernism come into these orthodox movements. So I think I have tried to map up these conceptual links And I'll see. I'll try to sum this up in the next session, inshallah.